Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK. We are on Instagram and Discord. Links are in the description. We're playing Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and Scott has Loot, the key to everything, as his commander. He's going to try really hard to play things from exile. Matt is playing Stella Wildcard. It's his favorite commander of the set. She'll have Matt spell slinging and burning down his opponents. Chris is playing Tinybones, the Pickpocket. He wants to fill up his opponent's graveyards with non-land permanents and use them for himself. And Kyle is playing the Gitrog, Ravenous Ride. He's going to saddle it with giant creatures and push its ability to the limit. Please like, comment, subscribe, tell your friends, and stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. Scott won the die roll, so he's going to kick us off by playing a tapped Rockfall Vale as his land before passing it over to Matt. He drops Steam Vents, and he'll have it enter the battlefield untapped at the cost of 2 points of life. Then casts Sleight of Hand, so we'll look at the top 2 cards of the library, put one of them into hand and one on the bottom. He then passes the turn over to Chris, who drops a Swamp Drop, and he immediately casts his commander because it costs 1. Can you believe it? He then passes to Kyle, who plays a forest and taps that for a wild growth, getting that ramp action on. It's like a Soul Ring, but worse. On Scott's turn, he played an island into a Doc Orlock, Grizzled Genius, reducing the cost of his exiled things. On Matt's turn, he plays Command Tower and uses that to cast a Thunderclap Drake. Afterwards, he passes the turn over to Chris, who draws, and he plays another Swamp as his land for turn before casting a super fancy Enchanted Tales Waste Not. He's hoping that'll do some work with all the discard abilities he has. On Kyle's turn, he plays a Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, before casting Topiary Stomper. When that ETBs, he'll go and find a basic land card and have it enter the battlefield tapped. He then passes the turn to Scott, who plays a Steam Vents of his own, paying 2 life and having it enter untapped. Then he casts his commander, Loot, the key to everything. So on his upkeep, he'll start getting some impulsive draw. On Matt's turn, he plays Shivan Reef as his land for turn before casting a super fancy Soul Ring. Right on time. He then casts Stella Wildcard, floating 1 colorless mana. But it does no good as he moves into combat, swinging at Scott in the air with his Thunderclap Drake. On to Chris's turn, he plays another fancy Swamp before casting Burglar Rat, making each opponent discard a card. And Waste Not is going to see all of those discards and have him draw a bunch, as well as make a 2/2 Zomboy. And while we find that token, he casts Zephyr Boots. That's an effort to make sure that his Tinybones can connect with an enemy and take advantage of his ability. He passes over to Kyle, who plays a Wall of Blood. It's diabolical. He's going to pay a bunch of life into that and use it for the Gitrog's ability. On Scott's turn, on his upkeep, his Loot triggers and he reveals a card in exile. He then drops an island before casting Jessica's Will. With his commander out, he can use both abilities, so he looks at Chris's hand and sees that he's got 6 cards, therefore 6 red manas. Then he'll also impulsively draw the top 3 cards of his library. Those are exiled this turn, but he can play them this turn. Then he casts from exile Headliner Scarlet. This thing's got haste, and it can also get him some more exiled cards on his upkeep. He then drops Dryad of the Elysian Grove. That allows him to play a forest from exile. Afterwards, he plays Kaibo, Uktabi Prince. And again, all of these things' costs are reduced thanks to his Doc Ock, or whatever it's called. He then moves into combat and attacks Chris using all of his eligible creatures. Chris just takes the damage, and he'll drop to 34. Afterwards, Scott passes the turn over to Matt. He plays a Jessica's Will of his own, and once again looks at Chris. And again, just like Scott, because Matt's commander is out onto the battlefield, Jessica's Will does both of its abilities. So he'll look at Chris's hand with 6 red mana generated, and again, 3 cards from the top of his library. Afterwards, he plays a Mountain as his land for turn, before using some of that floating red mana to play a Gutter Snipe. This will start burning down some of his opponents whenever he casts instants and sorceries. Stella sees this as the second card cast this turn, so he gets to impulsively draw the top card, but it's another land, so it doesn't do much here. He then casts a Pongify. Gutter Snipe says, yo, deal 2 damage to each opponent, and Stella Lee sees that this is the 3rd spell cast this turn, so she's activated in order to copy the Pongify, destroying Scott's Doc Ock as well as Kyle's Wall of Blood. This will have both Kyle and Scott create a 3/3 ape token. After that, Matt casts Lock and Load. This will trigger Gutter Snipe, again dealing 2 points of damage to each opponent. Then This will allow him to draw a total of 4 cards, because Lock and Load looks at all the other cards cast that turn. As a follow-up, Matt drew into a big score, so he's going to cast that here, discarding a card as well. So Waste Not is going to trigger, and Waste Not will have Chris draw another card. And when Big Score was cast, Gutter Snipe triggers and dealt 2 more points of damage to each opponent. Big Score resolves, so Matt will draw 2 cards as well as generate 2 treasure tokens. After the fact, he moves into the red zone and he'll attack Chris in the air with his Thunderclap Drake, dropping him to 26. He then passes the turn. Chris draws and plays another Swamp as his land for turn before casting Siphon Mind. This will have each player discard a card, and then Chris gets to draw a total of 3 cards after that. However, great news for Chris, Waste Not is going to see each opponent discarding cards and generate some sort of value based off of that. So Chris gets 2 black floating mana, he gets a whole nother Zomboy, and gets to draw a card as well. He then casts Torok, Dread Cantor, as a follow-up before attacking Matt with one of his zombies, hitting him for 2 because Gutter Snipe isn't worth a trade. He then passes to Kyle, who immediately plays Calling Ritual on his first main phase. This will destroy everything that's 2 mana value or less, which is an awful lot right now. In addition, for all of the artifacts that are hitting the bin, Kibo will trigger, so he'll get Thick Swole for every artifact that hit the bin. Sadly for Chris, he lost his entire board state. Kyle generates a bunch of black and green mana, 13 if our count is correct. He then uses some of that to cast the Gitrog Ravenous Ride. And as a follow-up, he'll play a Gulta Primal Hunger, cost being reduced thanks to the power of his creatures. He then casts an Assassin's Trophy, killing Stella Lee wildcard dead. Kyle then, using Gulta, saddles up the Gitrog monster. And he moves into combat, so he'll swing at Matt with his 6/5 commander damage, dropping him to 29. Afterwards, Gitrog triggers, so he'll sacrifice Gulta, drawing a whopping 12 cards and putting out all the lands from among them onto the battlefield tapped. He got 3 whole lands that way. On to Scott's turn. On his upkeep, he has 2 triggers, and in response to them, he activates Kaibo, and the guys take turns drawing their best banana. So my question to you is, who drew it better? Scott then resolves Loot's triggered ability, so he'll exile the top 3 cards of his library in this case. Miss Scarlet's ability triggers afterwards, so he'll exile the next card face down. He gets to look at it, of course. Thanks to his Dryad of the Elysian Grove, he then plays both of the lands exiled this way. So he got a Cascade Bluffs and a command tower in the form of a Cybertron onto the battlefield. He then casts Retrieve Prey, the adventure side of Tlincalli Hunter. So he exiles Doc Ock once again and can play that this turn, which he does immediately. So he gets that back out onto the battlefield, again reducing the costs of his things that are in exile. Therefore, his Volcanic Torrent, which was exiled by Scarlet, is cast, and it has Cascade. So first, he will in fact Cascade until he found a Ren's Resolve, which will exile the top 2 cards of his library, and he could play those things till his next turn. Then, Volcanic Torrent resolves as well, dealing 4 damage to each creature and Planeswalker out onto the battlefield. So this kills Kyle's Topiary Stomper as well as Matt's Gutter Snipe. He then moves into combat, swinging at both Kyle and Chris, dealing them a bunch of damage before passing the turn to Matt. He plays Iris, Roar of the Storm. At this point, this had a nice cost reduction, and he should be able to make a bunch of 4/4 dragons with prowess and flying every time he casts his second spell, and in this case, it's a Veyran Voice of Duality. He used his banana to do so, so Kaibo got a little bit bigger. Then, he makes that 4/4 dragon with prowess and flying before passing the turn over to Chris. He draws and plays another Swamp Drop, before casting Tinybones the Pickpocket once again. Afterwards, he plays Vicious Rumors. So his opponents will suffer a bunch of things: a damage, a discard, a mill, and Chris gains a whole life in the process. But his opponent's graveyards are filling up nicely with a bunch of things that Tinybones could eventually take advantage of. Afterwards, on Kyle's turn, he plays Phyrexian Reclamation. He immediately pays 2 and 2 life in order to bring back something from his graveyard to his hand, and in this case, it was a Wall of Blood. This can be used to diabolical effect with his commander out, which he's going to do now. So he pays 1 life into Wall of Blood, then saddles up the Gitrog monster. He then moves into combat, swinging at Scott, who takes all the beats, taking 6 points of commander damage. In response to the Gitrog's triggered ability, Kyle sinks 10 more life into the Wall of Blood, making it an 11 power creature that is now sacrificed to the Gitrog. Therefore, Kyle will draw 11 cards and put all the lands from among them onto the battlefield tapped once again. After ramping into insanity, he uses his banana to generate a green mana. Then he'll use that to cast a Deathrite Shaman, and that'll have him gain 2 life when he cashed in the banana as well. Kaibo got bigger by getting a +1/+1 counter. On Scott's turn, on his upkeep, he gets 3 more cards exiled thanks to loot, and Scarlet will give him an additional card exiled face down once again. Dryad of the Elysian Grove still enables him to have 2 lands played per turn, so he brings those out of exile, the Otawara Soaring City, as well as the Rejuvenating Springs, both entering the battlefield untapped, of course. Then he ramps himself with Rampant Growth, Secret Lair drop, and finds a mountain that enters the battlefield tapped. After the fact, he casts the Tail the Suspect side of Kalain Inquisitive Prodigy, so he'll get to investigate and play an additional land this turn, so he brings that mountain out of exile and enters the battlefield. And then, again from exile, he'll cast Kalain Inquisitive Prodigy off of its adventure. Yeah, it's a 3/4 flying vigilance that blows up artifacts. That's pretty good. He then moves into combat, swinging his monkey at Matt and Doc and Scarlet at Kyle. In his second main phase, he cashes in his clue, drawing a card. He found a Utopia Sprawl, so he'll pay for that and have it attached to a forest he controls, which they all are forests. He then passes the turn over to Matthew, who draws and plays a Faithless Looting. This will trigger Iris, Veyron, and his dragon, and Veyron allows all of these things to happen again. Faithless Looting resolves, allowing him to draw 2 and pitch 2 to the bin. From among those cards drawn, he found a mountain, so he'll play that as his land for turn, and then he'll cast Urabrask. This will have him start generating mana as well as dealing damage to his opponents, but it also made him another dragon thanks to Iris's ability, being the second card that he cast. He moved into combat swinging at Kyle and Scott, dealing a bunch of damage before passing the turn to Chris. He plays a Mortuary Mire as his land for turn, getting a Torok back to the top of his library. Afterwards, he plays a Turgrid, God of Fright, making it real painful if anybody has to discard. He then uses the Evoke ability on Grief, making Kyle have to discard a card. Kyle decided to pitch a Grave Pact to the bin, which of course Turgrid says, yo, give it to Chris for free. And of course, Kyle had assessed that Chris can't really make great use of a Grave Pact right now with his board state. On Kyle's turn, he first activates his Deathrite Shaman, generating a mana in order to use Rise of the Dark Realms. And things get kind of disgusting. So Kyle will be able to reanimate every single creature that is within a graveyard. Also, not caring about the Grave Pact he just gave to Chris in that regard. So Kyle gets a disgusting amount of creatures out of everybody's bins. He has them start entering the battlefield with a Railway Brawler first, making a lot of sense. Then Niv Mizzet Perun ETBs, Burglar Rat as well, making each opponent discard a card, which at this point is only Chris. Then Grief ETB'd, Kyle has Chris once again pitch a card to the bin. Then he brings out a Gutter Snipe, as well as a Topiary Stomper. Chris, being a team player here, goes and finds Kyle a Swamp to ETB, in order for Kyle to keep doing his thing, with a Mizzix, followed by a Thunderclap Drake. He gets a Hunted Bone Brute as well, and when that ETB'd, he allows Chris to get 2 1/1 white dog creatures. He gets a Yargle Glutton of Urborg out onto the battlefield, followed by a Laelia, the Blade Reforged. He then found a Orin Frostfang, so everything has Death Touch as well. Chris gave him a Hypnotic Spectre from the bin, followed by a Gulta, Primal Hunger, who we see again here. And again, all of these creatures getting +1/+1 counters for days. He gets a Villas Broker of Blood as well. Kyle gets that Wall of Blood back out onto the battlefield. And I mean, it's not really a party unless Vorinclex is there. But we're not done yet. Kyle gets a Rotting Regisaur out onto the battlefield, He also gets a very threatening Lord of the Rings Birds of Paradise. It's not threatening at all. And he also gets a Mosswood Dread Knight. At this point, Scott, Matt, and Chris are all looking to see if they have a board wipe in hand. Just kidding, Scott and Matt don't have a hand, and Chris has one card, and it's not a board wipe. Kyle saddles up the Gitrog with a 24/24 Ghalta, and moves into combat at Scott with Lelia and the Gitrog. Lelia triggers, so he'll exile a thing. Lelia got bigger, and they crash into Scott, bringing him to 6. Kyle then sacrifices Ghalta, and Turgrid sees this, so Chris gets a Ghalta, but Kyle drew 24 whole cards. Niv Mizzet says, hello, I'm going to start dealing a bunch of damage, so Kyle divides it among his opponents, bringing Scott to 4 and Matt and Chris both to 12. He finishes resolving the Gitrog's ability by bringing out a bunch more lands out onto the battlefield tapped. He then casts an Exsanguinate where X equals 1. This will trigger Gutter Snipe, dealing 2 points of damage to each opponent. Niv Mizzet will have him draw a card, pinging Chris for 1. Then each of his opponents lose 1 life, and Kyle gains 3 life. Kyle then moves into end step and has to discard an astronomical amount of cards. And Chris has a Turgrid out, so this game is not over yet. Chris drops Guardian Project on the battlefield, followed by a Lupine Prototype, a Hunted Troll. This will give Scott 4 1/1 blue fairy creature tokens. Then Chris plays an Arbor Elf, a Rampaging Baloths, and again, each one of these creatures being named differently lets him draw a card. He played a Boreal Druid. We found Scott's fairy creature tokens. I'm just going to say that this is an enormous amount of cards that are just being dumped out onto people's boards. Kyle followed by Chris. It's kind of disgusting. Chris found that Garrick's Uprising from Kyle's discarded cards. Then he played Dictate of Erebos, as well as a Spelunking. So that'll have him draw another card, and he could play a land from it. In this case, it's a Swamp. It is a mono-black deck after all. And the good news is for Chris, he gets a 4/4 Beast token, thanks to his Rampaging Baloth stolen from Kyle. This was all on Kyle's end step. And once that turn is finally over, we move into Scott's turn. On his upkeep, Kyle responds to Loot's triggered ability by casting an Invigorate, allowing Scott to gain 3 points of life, but Gutter Snipe triggers, dealing 2 points of damage to each player. Then Kyle will sink 1 life into the Wall of Blood, therefore triggering Vilis, drawing him a card, and pinging Scott with Niv Mizzet's ability. In response, Scott sacrifices his banana token, but Kyle just does it again. So that will kill Scott dead, unfortunately. They clean up their board states. Kyle loses the couple of creatures that belong to Scott. Then on to Matt's turn. He plays an island as his land before casting from flashback Faithless Looting once again. This will trigger Niv Mizzet, allowing Kyle to draw a card and ping Matt for 1. This also triggers all of the prowess abilities on Matt's creatures. Kyle has too many flying blockers, so Matt concedes to second place, attacking Chris in the air, dealing him enough damage to knock him out of the game. Onto Kyle's turn 7, he draws, pings Matt 1 point of life, and swings out with everything he has. And we're pretty sure that that's enough to knock Matt out of the game, therefore making Kyle the winner. Congratulations, buddy. That Rise of the Dark Realms is insane in this case. As promised, here's Meatball. He's so chunky. I'd also like to take a moment to thank all of our Patreon subscribers. Your contributions truly do go a long way in supporting the channel's content, so thank you very much for your continued support. If you're interested in becoming a Patreon subscriber, you could do so by checking out patreon.com/mostlycasualcommander. For as little as $1 per month, your contribution will grant you exclusive access to a Discord server, as well as early access to the videos that we create. You can also follow us on our Instagram. There you can see some behind-the-scenes footage and photos. We also share some content that you can only find there, not on YouTube, so check it out. So that wraps this video up. Please let us know what you thought in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, thanks for watching.